He was the biggest movie star on the planet, the king of Hollywood, a man with more money, more fame, and more reason to stay home than almost anyone alive in 1942. Instead, at 41 years old, well past the age most men were even eligible to serve, Clark Gable strapped himself into the belly of a B-17 bomber over Nazi Germany and let German gunners shoot directly at him. One shell tore through the aircraft, close enough to blow the heel clean off his shoe. Decades later, people are still asking the same question. Why would a man who had everything to lose walk straight into the one place that could take it all away? Let's get into it. Before there was a king of Hollywood, there was a boy named William Clark Gable, born on February 1, 1901, in Cadiz, Ohio, to an oil well driller and a mother who died before he turned 1 year old. He grew up hard, working in Ohio tire factories and Oklahoma oil fields before he ever set foot near a movie camera. By the early 1930s, that same rough, unpolished toughness had somehow translated into the biggest box office draw in American film history. He won the Academy Award for It Happened One Night in 1934. He played Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind in 1939, a role that made him arguably the single most recognizable man in the country. By the time the 1940s arrived, Gable wasn't just a movie star, he was an institution. In 1939, Gable married actress Carole Lombard, a fast-talking, sharp-witted comedic star who by most accounts was the love of his life. Friends who knew the couple described a marriage that felt genuinely different from the usual Hollywood arrangement. Two people who actually seemed to enjoy being married to each other. That happiness didn't last. In January 1942, just weeks after America entered World War II, Lombard traveled to Indiana to headline a war bond rally, raising money for the war effort in her home state. She sold more than $2 million in bonds in a single night. Rather than take the train home as originally planned, she insisted on flying back to Los Angeles to save time and get back to Gable sooner. On January 16, 1942, the TWA plane carrying her slammed into Potosi Mountain in Nevada. All 22 people aboard were killed instantly, including Lombard's mother. She was 33 years old. Gable was reportedly inconsolable. He personally joined the search party that climbed the mountain to recover the wreckage, refusing to simply wait at home for news. Friends later said he lost close to 20 pounds in the weeks that followed and barely spoke. The man who had spent a decade playing the most confident figure in American film had, for the first time in his adult life, nothing left to say. What happened next surprised almost everyone who thought they understood Clark Gable. He didn't retreat into grief. He sent a telegram directly to the White House requesting a combat assignment. President Franklin Roosevelt personally responded, urging him to stay exactly where he was, in Hollywood, where his films and public image were considered valuable to wartime morale. Gable read the message and did the opposite of what it asked. On August 12, 1942, at age 41, Gable enlisted as a private in the United States Army Air Forces. Studio executives at MGM were reportedly stunned. Their single biggest asset, a man whose face alone sold out theaters across the country, had just signed away his safety for a private's uniform and a barracks bunk. He completed a grueling 13-week officer candidate school at Miami Beach, training alongside men half his age, and emerged commissioned as a second lieutenant. He didn't stop there. Gable specifically requested training as an aerial gunner and combat photographer, two of the most exposed jobs available on a heavy bomber. He was assigned to the 351st Bombardment Group, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses out of RAF Polbrook in England. Officially, his mission was to film a recruiting documentary titled Combat America, capturing footage of aerial gunners in action to help the Army Air Forces recruit more young men into the gunner program back home. Gable could have shot that footage from the safety of a training base. Instead, he insisted on flying real combat missions over enemy territory to get it. His first flight came aboard a B-17 nicknamed 8-Ball Mark II. It would not be his last, and it would not be his closest call. On a later mission over Germany, flying aboard an aircraft the crew had dubbed Ain't It Gruesome, a German 20mm anti-aircraft shell tore straight through the flight deck of the bomber. It missed Gable by inches. The blast blew the heel clean off his own shoe as it passed. One slightly different angle, one slightly different second, and the King of Hollywood dies in a burning bomber over Nazi Germany at 41 years old, just months after burying his wife. There's a rumor that has followed this story for decades, one that Gable himself apparently found darkly amusing. According to accounts that circulated both during and after the war, Adolf Hitler was so infuriated by the idea of America's biggest star flying combat missions against the Reich that he personally offered a reward for Gable's capture, wanting him taken alive rather than killed. Whether or not that exact bounty was ever formally documented, German intelligence absolutely knew who was flying overhead, and Luftwaffe pilots reportedly received specific instructions to watch for his aircraft. Gable was, by every account, aware of the story, and he kept flying anyway. Over the course of his deployment, Gable flew 5 combat missions, manning waist guns aboard B-17s during raids over occupied Europe, facing the same flak fields and fighter attacks as every other young airman in his squadron. He was 41 years old, doing a job the Army usually reserved for men in their late teens and early 20s, most of them young enough to be his sons. Crew members who flew alongside him later said Gable never once asked for special treatment, never pulled rank to avoid the more dangerous rotations, and insisted on carrying his share of the workload like any other gunner on the aircraft. For his service, he earned the Air Medal, and later the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest decorations available for aerial combat. The physical conditions alone were brutal enough without the enemy involved. B-17 crews flew at altitudes above 20,000 feet in unpressurized, unheated aircraft, where temperatures routinely dropped to 40 or 50 degrees below zero. Frostbite was a constant threat. Oxygen masks could freeze solid mid-flight, and gunners had to operate heavy machine guns with thick gloved hands in conditions that could kill a man from exposure alone before an enemy fighter ever got close. Gable endured all of it, directly alongside airmen young enough to be his sons, carrying a level of physical hardship that had nothing to do with the comfortable, controlled world of a Hollywood soundstage. What almost nobody in Hollywood knew at the time was just how deliberately Gable had put himself in that position. Studio insiders and biographers who studied his wartime letters later suggested something darker sat underneath the official recruiting film explanation. Gable had lost the one person who made his fame feel worth anything, and flying combat missions over Nazi Germany gave him something his life in Los Angeles no longer could: a reason to still be alive that had nothing to do with being a movie star. He was eventually promoted to major, and by mid-1944, the Army made the decision to pull him from combat duty and bring him home. Some historians believe the Army simply couldn't risk losing him. A downed and captured Clark Gable would have been an enormous propaganda win for Nazi Germany, and the risk of that outcome eventually outweighed whatever recruiting value his continued missions provided. Gable was discharged in June 1944 and returned to a Hollywood that had changed almost as much as he had. For years afterward, Gable rarely discussed the specifics of what he'd actually seen in the air over Germany. He gave interviews about the discipline of military life, about missing the structure of the Army after he returned to civilian filmmaking. But he almost never spoke in detail about the missions themselves, about the shell that took the heel off his shoe, or about what it actually felt like to sit in a bomber knowing an entire country wanted him dead. Those who worked with him after the war noticed something had shifted. The easy, effortless charm was still there on camera, but colleagues described a man who seemed to carry something heavier underneath it now, something the war had left behind that fame alone couldn't touch. There's another detail worth sitting with. When Gable finally returned to MGM after his discharge in 1944, the studio and much of the country expected him to simply pick up where he'd left off, stepping back into the same kind of charming leading man roles that had defined his pre-war career. Instead, colleagues noticed subtle differences in the work itself. Directors who worked with him in the years immediately following the war described an actor who brought a quieter, more restrained intensity to certain scenes. An actor who no longer needed to perform toughness because he had already lived a version of it that no soundstage could replicate. He rarely, if ever, discussed his missions in press interviews, deflecting questions about combat with a joke or a quick change of subject. a pattern strikingly similar to other veterans of his generation who came home from the war and simply chose silence over explanation. Gable went on to make several more successful films through the 1950s, closing out his career opposite Marilyn Monroe in The Misfits in 1960. He died of a heart attack on November 16, 1960, just 12 days after filming Wrapped, at the age of 59. He was buried beside Carole Lombard, the woman whose death had sent him at 41 years old into the cockpit of a bomber over Nazi Germany in the first place. Clark Gable didn't need the war. He had already won everything Hollywood could offer him twice over before he ever put on a uniform. But somewhere over Germany, in a burning aircraft with his own shoe blown apart beside him, the King of Hollywood found something that stardom had never been able to give him: a reason to keep going. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more untold histories of the men who lived through history's darkest hours, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.